So I move this disallowance motion because it is a skewed priority for this government and this parliament to be pursuing. And the reason I say it is a skewed priority is because if you fail to have the houses constructed that Australians need to live in, but simultaneously you overly stimulate the demand side with Canberra's gimmicks, you end up with a worse situation. And that is the reality that Australia's younger people are now living. They're living that reality because the supply side has collapsed, and the numbers are very clear. 200,000 houses a year were completed in this country under the last government. Now we are down to 170,000. And it doesn't look like we're going to improve. And then these 5% deposits, which are not means tested, and the 2% deposits with the shared equity scheme and the other things, these are all heating up that entry-level point of the market. And so what you see in the data that has come through in the first month of the operation of the 5% scheme, which is now unmeans tested and without any place caps, is a very large, in fact the largest uptick in prices at the entry level in years. And the reality is that first home prices are too high. They are too high, and when you look at the upper end of the market, those prices aren't moving. Now, our concern here is actually not the prices of the houses for the very wealthy or the people who can look after themselves, but we want to have a country where a person can purchase a house on an average wage. And the problem with the inflation in the house prices at the entry level is that is getting further and further away. So no matter how well-intentioned some of these demand-side measures may be, they are counterproductive. They are counterproductive. And they are counterproductive because they are making the dream illusory, or they are making the dream impossible. Now, in the case of the 5% deposit scheme, we're looking at 95% mortgages, which are very heavy amounts of debt for people to be carrying. And so what that has done is it's brought forward the demand from others who would not usually use government programs. But in the case of this disallowance, which is in relation to the Help to Buy program, this was announced by the government in opposition back in 2022. And we said at the time that perhaps under the shared equity program that you'd be sitting around the Christmas table with mum and dad and the kids and Mr Albanese. But I mean, that won't be the case this Christmas because the government haven't even been able to get the scheme in order. They haven't been able to get the scheme in order. So it's taking a long time to work through all the various issues they need to work through with the states. So even if you were relying on this as being the great hope, the hope of the side, as it were, you'll be waiting a long time. And so this disallowance takes us into some of the mechanics. And one of the things the government has done to lay the groundwork for this scheme is to exempt itself, exempt the Commonwealth from the credit laws, because the government's view is, well, the credit laws are for other people. They can be applicable to the banks or the private financiers and the credit unions and everyone else. They can all comply with our rules that we've set. Now, don't forget, of course, we also say that we're against red tape, even though we've created 5,000 regulations in the first term, 700 regulations in this term, but we hate red tape. So, look, if you can keep up with it and you can fashion it into something that's coherent, then you're going better than I am. But the point is that exempting the Commonwealth from the credit laws means that there'll be no checks and balances no checks and balances for the Commonwealth portion. Because the way this scheme works is that the Commonwealth will provide up to 40% of the value of the house. The other 60% in the main, or the other 58%, given it's a 2% scheme, would be provided through a loan from a bank or financial institution, and that bank or that financial institution would have to go through the checks, the credit laws demand, the capacity to repay, the other capability assessments that you would expect to be undertaken. But for the Commonwealth share, there'll be nothing. Nothing. There won't be any checks. Mr. Chalmers, or Dr. Chalmers, whatever he calls himself, he'll send a cheque for the cheque. The carrier pigeons will take the cheque, and it'll be 40%, and it'll be no questions asked. There'll be no questions asked. Now, the problem with that is that we're looking at a $6 billion scheme. $6 billion. Now, maybe when you're running deficits as far as the eye can see, and you're covered in red ink, maybe it doesn't matter. But I think it does matter, because the Australian people would look at that and say, well, why would we be signing over our taxpayer funds without any sense of whether that money will ever be returned? Why would we do that? I guess that's really the point. That's really getting to the heart of this disallowance. That the Coalition does not believe, and I'll put on record for transparency, that we do not support this program. We voted against this program. This program was agreed with the Greens. Okay? This program was agreed with the Greens, and we voted against it. But I'm surprised, noting our objection against the policy, that the government has decided to exempt itself from the credit laws and therefore will not be undertaking any due diligence as to how up to $6.3 billion of taxpayer funds will be spent. Now, I have to say that I probably don't have a great record of agreement with ASIC. In general, I don't think they've performed strongly. But they, on this occasion, did make some, I thought, constructive and important comments where they warned the government against doing this. They warned the government against doing this. And they made the point that the Crown is captured by the Credit Act for good reason. Because if the Crown is giving credit, then it's credit like any other credit, and it should be assessed. But the government knows best, and they decided, well, these corporate cops, I mean, maybe the government thinks, like we do, that they're pretty hopeless. Fair enough. But the government took the view that, well, these people don't know anything. We would just ignore them, put that piece of paper in the bin, and they went on their merry way, and they've exempted themselves from the Credit Act. So when the taxpayer underwrites up to 40%, well, it doesn't underwrite, they actually literally provide the 40% of the house. They're not underwriting it. This is not a guarantee scheme. This is a funding scheme. They give the money over, right? The person's got to get their conveyancer and get their lawyer, and they buy the house. The 40% Commonwealth share is just transferred over. That's it. All the best. All the best for the future. Hope for the best. It's a hope for the best scheme. And so the taxpayer is just expected to hope for the best. And maybe the market will go up, maybe it will go down, maybe something good will happen, maybe something bad will happen, maybe it will be foreclosed upon, maybe it won't be. But either way, there will be no checks and no balances. And I guess would say to you that, Acting Deputy President, that I think this is a reckless approach. It's a reckless approach with taxpayer funds. And as I said, noting our objection to this scheme, I mean, we don't believe that the Australian people want to co-own their private house with the government. Okay, that's our objection. But putting that aside, if you were going to spend $6 billion, surely you would want to think, well, we want to try and get some of it back. We should at least maybe think about our risk management plan, because it would be good if we could get some of that back in the future, because then we can pay off the debt and we can pay for other services the community might want. So I think it is a reckless approach, and that's why I urge the chamber to think carefully about whether or not we do want to be setting up a two-tier system. Should we have a two-tier system? I think the answer is no. I think if you want to get into the business of providing credit, then surely we have competitive neutral. I think this is interference, by the way, but surely there's got to be some kind of commitment to competitive neutrality, because if it's good enough for everyone else to have to comply with the tests that people would expect, capacity to repay and everything else, then why wouldn't the Commonwealth do that? So ultimately, this is a pattern of behaviour we've seen across the government, though, that there is a set of rules for the economy, and then there is a set of rules which applies to the government sector, where the government will effectively act as a business in so many forms that they are prepared to write their own rules, prepared to set their own standards. And I think that the Australian people will judge this very, very harshly if there are monies lost in this scheme, because ultimately, if the government is going to expend, now let's imagine that that money is going to be expended over the term of this parliament. Okay, they've got $6.2 billion that they want to spend on this scheme. Okay, now by the way, this money largely is off budget. Now it's still public money. I mean, welcome to Australia in 2025. When you look at the public finances, you've got no idea really what's going on, because there's a huge failure of integrity. But the Help to Buy funds have been borrowed by the Commonwealth. They're not on the main budget bottom line. They're borrowed by the Commonwealth, so they do hit the national debt number. So the taxpayer is taking on debt. They're borrowing this money. This money then is given to people, up to 40% of their property. And so the taxpayer will want to know, well, what happened. And we'll be asking questions about where that money ultimately has gone. What is the return over the course of this parliament on that $6 billion, if it is to be expended? I mean, at this rate, maybe none of the money will ever actually leave Canberra, because this was a promise from 2022. Seems to be taking a very long time. So I make the point, Acting Deputy President, and compliment you on your attire, that
thank you, Senator.
The point of this disallowance is very clear. We do not believe that it is appropriate for the Commonwealth to be exempting itself from its own credit laws when it is providing money to people so that they can acquire a property. I note again our objection to the scheme put on record for transparency, but I want to make it very clear that our objection in this regard is about competitive neutrality and the safety of public funds. Will there be any provision or any check that the Commonwealth will undertake to ensure that taxpayers' funds are going to be returned in some form? Will there be any risk management plan at all? Because it looks like there will be none, because the government doesn't want to apply any protection or any oversight on the up to 40% that will be provided to people for the Commonwealth share in the Help to Buy scheme. So that is the question before the Senate today. The question is, should the Commonwealth be able to exempt itself from its own rules, and should taxpayers have to just accept the fact that the government doesn't give a rat's about $6 billion of taxpayer funds? It's not going to do any checks. It's not going to bother to ask whether the money is ever going to come back. And ultimately, I think if the answer to the question is the government of Australia doesn't care about whether the $6 billion will ever be returned, then I think that the government will be judged very harshly. And so I urge the Senate to consider the disallowance very carefully and support it, and force the government back to the drawing board. It should not exempt itself from the credit laws. It should, on this occasion, listen to the advice of its corporate regulator, which has said to it that you should not exempt the Crown from the credit laws, that the Crown is providing credit like any other organisation, and it should be subject to the same obligations, because, of course, the Crown's money is not the Crown's money. It actually belongs to the Australian taxpayers, And so I urge the government to reconsider, and I urge the crossbench to vote for this disallowance today.